17 seconds. That's all the audio clip was. Not a video. Not a photo. Just sound. 17 seconds of a chair scraping across a hardwood floor. 17 seconds of a man's voice, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has never once in his life had a reason to raise it, saying the words, "I would spend the next 4 months trying to make mean something in a court of law. Sign it, Mrs. Reeves. Or next time, I won't knock." And then, underneath that voice so quiet I almost missed it on the first listen, the sound that actually broke me. Not a scream. Not a crash. Not anything loud enough to call for help. Just the sound of a 72-year-old woman trying to swallow her own crying before the man standing in front of her could hear it. I played it once standing in the hallway outside my commanding officer's briefing room at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, my lunch still on the table inside, my coffee going cold. I played it a second time sitting on the floor of the women's restroom, with my back against the stall door, and my boots flat on the tile. I played it a third time just to make sure I had heard what I thought I had heard. Then I stood up, straightened my uniform in the mirror, walked back into that briefing room, told General Hargrove I needed emergency family leave effective immediately, and watched him reach for the forms without asking me a single question. That's the thing about 18 years in uniform that nobody tells you when you sign up at 23. The Army teaches you to keep your face so completely still that the people around you will fill in whatever story they need to fill in. Hargrove looked at me that afternoon and saw something that made him stop mid-sentence and reach for his pen. What he didn't see, what I made absolutely certain he didn't see, was that my hands, tucked behind my back in parade, rest out of nothing but muscle memory, were shaking hard enough that I could feel something tapping against my knuckle. I don't wear a wedding ring. I haven't for 11 years. Those were not my hands anymore. Those were the hands of somebody's daughter, coming home. The drive from Fort Campbell to Harlan County, Kentucky, is 3 hours and 40 minutes on a good day. I made it in 3 hours and 8 minutes. Which is the kind of math that only works when you stop thinking about speed limits somewhere around the Tennessee border and start thinking about your mother's breathing on a 17-second audio clip instead. I want to tell you about Harlan County, because it matters to understand what I drove into that evening. It's coal country, or it was, for 100 years until the mines started closing one by one through the 90s and the 2000s, and then closing faster through the 2010s, and by the time I came home that November evening, the county had a poverty rate pushing 40% and a main street, where 2 out of every 3 storefronts had paper in the windows and handwritten signs that said things like, "Thank you for 22 years, times or times, God bless." Harlan Times in the kind of handwriting that tells you the person writing. It was trying very hard not to cry while they did it. I had grown up here, graduated from Harlan County High School in 2001, walked across a stage in a gymnasium that smelled like industrial floor cleaner and somebody's grandmother's perfume, and driven away 3 weeks later with everything I owned in the back of a pickup truck and a contract with the United States Army that felt, at 23, like the most solid thing I had ever held in my hands. I had not come back enough. That's the honest truth of it. I had come back for Christmas when I could, for the occasional long weekend, for my father's funeral 2 years ago. But I had not come back enough to notice, gradually, the way a town can hollow out while your back is turned. The way something that was full can become empty so slowly that nobody thinks to say it out loud until one day it already is. My mother's house sat at the end of a gravel road 3 miles outside of town. The porch light was on when I pulled up, which meant she had heard me coming. She always heard me coming, even when I thought I was being quiet. 32 years of raising me, and she had developed a sensitivity to the particular sound of a vehicle slowing down on gravel that I suspected she would carry for the rest of her life. She was sitting in the kitchen when I came in, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold, the way she held things when she was trying to give her hands something to do. She looked at me the way mothers look at daughters they have not seen in 4 months. Which is to say, she looked at me like she was taking inventory, checking for damage, cataloging everything she had missed. "You didn't have to drive all the way," she said. I sat down across from her and put my hands flat on the table between us. "Mom," I said. I heard the recording. Her face didn't change. That was the thing that scared me most, actually, not that she cried, not that she flinched. She just looked at me with those steady, dark eyes that I had been trying to learn to replicate for 18 years, and said, "Ruth shouldn't have sent you that. Ruth did exactly the right thing." She looked down at her mug. I handled it. "He told you he'd come back. People say a lot of things." I looked at her for a long moment. My mother, Loretta Reeves, 72 years old, 5 feet 1 inch tall, with arthritis in both hands and a metal plate in her left hip, and a stubbornness in her that I was fairly certain was structural, built into her bones the way rebar is built into concrete. She had run the watch repair shop my father built on Main Street for 43 years. She had raised 2 children on the wages from that shop while my father worked double shifts at the mine to keep the health insurance. She had buried that man 2 years ago, after a year of watching the VA system misplace his paperwork, delay his medication approvals, and send him letters addressed to the wrong last name, and she had done all of that without asking anyone for help she hadn't specifically requested. She was not a woman who collapsed easily, but I had heard her on that recording, and I knew what swallowed crying sounded like from a woman who considered crying in front of other people a form of surrender. "Tell me about the contract," I said. She sighed. "Set down the mug." And for the next 40 minutes, she told me. The man who had come to the shop was named Daniel Marsh. He represented a company called Harlan Revitalization Partners, which had an office in a newly renovated building on the corner of Main and 3rd, one of the only renovated buildings on Main Street, which should have told everyone something. But when you've watched enough storefronts go dark, you start to feel grateful for any light at all. He had come 3 times. The first time he was friendly, almost charming. The kind of man who uses your first name before you've offered it and treats the familiarity as a compliment. The second time he brought paperwork. The third time, the time Ruth recorded, he brought a very specific kind of patience that had nothing friendly left in it. The contract offered $47,000 for the shop and the land beneath it. I asked my mother if she knew what the property had been assessed at in the most recent county valuation. She said she hadn't looked. I pulled up the county assessor's website on my phone right there at the kitchen table. The assessed value for the parcel was $312,000. My mother looked at the number on my screen for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, very quietly, "He told me it was a fair market offer given current conditions." "He lied to you," I said. She folded her hands together on the table. "Maya, I know you want to fix this, but these people have lawyers and I have a watch shop that hasn't turned a profit in 2 years. That's exactly why I'm not going to let you sign anything." She looked at me with an expression I remembered from childhood, not anger, something more complicated than anger. The look of a woman who loved you so much. She was willing to argue with you about your own protection. "I'm not asking for your permission," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm not asking for yours either." I poured us both fresh tea, and we sat there a while longer in the particular silence of 2 stubborn women who love each other too much to walk away from the table. Outside the kitchen window, the November dark was absolute. The way rural dark gets when there's no ambient light from anything close enough to matter. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom with the same water stain on the ceiling I had stared at through every insomnia of my adolescence, I started building a picture. It's what 18 years in intelligence-adjacent work teaches you to do before anything else. Before you act, before you confront, before you even decide what you're angry about, you build a picture. You find out what you're actually looking at. I pulled out my laptop and I started with the company name. Harlan Revitalization Partners had been registered in Kentucky in 2018. Director of Operations. A man named Robert Kane, whose name returned almost nothing on a standard search. A LinkedIn profile with no photo. A business registration in 3 states. And a mention in a 2019 local newspaper article about commercial development in eastern Kentucky that described him as times an investor committed to regional economic growth. The kind of language that could mean almost anything, which is usually a sign. It means something specific. Someone doesn't want you to know. The board of directors was where I stopped. There were 6 names. I read through them the way you read through any list, scanning for patterns, until I hit the 5th name and felt the specific sensation of the floor not quite being where I expected it. Brigadier General Marcus Webb, United States Army, retired 2021. I stared at that name for a long time. Marcus Webb had been my brigade commander at Fort Campbell for 3 years before his retirement. He had written one of the 2 letters of recommendation attached to my promotion package, the package currently sitting with the board that would decide in approximately 60 days whether I made full colonel. He was the closest thing I had to a mentor in the Army, outside of my direct chain of command, a man I had eaten Thanksgiving dinner with twice, when duty kept both of us from getting home, a man whose judgment I had trusted with decisions that mattered. I sat there in the dark with my laptop screen, the only light in the room, and I made myself think about it slowly, because the slow version was the one I could afford to be wrong about. There could be an explanation. Retired generals sit on boards. It's common, it's legal, it's the revolving door that everybody knows about and nobody particularly likes, but it exists, and it's real, and it doesn't by itself mean anything except that Marcus Webb had a connection to a company that was trying to pressure my mother into selling her property at a fraction of its value. I closed the laptop, lay back, stared at the water stain. I did not sleep. The next morning I drove into town before the shops opened and walked Main Street slowly, the way you walk somewhere when you're trying to see it instead of just moving through it. What I saw was this. Out of 22 commercial storefronts, on the 2-block stretch of downtown Harlan, 14 were closed. Of the 8 that remained open, 5 had something I hadn't noticed the night before. Small placards in the lower right corner of their front windows, white cardstock with blue lettering, that read, Harlan Revitalization Partners Future Home, of blank. The blank was different on each one. A wellness center, a co-working space, a farm-to-table restaurant, which struck me as an interesting concept for a county where 40% of the population was food insecure. 5 storefronts. 5 buildings that had already been acquired, already earmarked, already dressed up with the language of progress. My mother's shop was one of the 3 on the street that had no placard. I stood on the sidewalk in front of it for a moment. My father's name was still on the window, in the gold lettering he had painted himself the week the shop opened, in 1979. The paint had faded at the edges, the way gold paint does over decades, not peeling, just softening, becoming quieter. He had been meticulous about that sign. I remembered him repainting it when I was about 8 years old. Watching him work with a brush so small, it seemed impossible that it could be the right tool for the job. Laying each letter down with a patience I had not understood then, and understood completely now. I went to the county records office when it opened at 9. I want to tell you something about county records offices, because I have now spent more hours in them than I ever expected to. They are the most honest rooms in any system of government. Everything that gets done in secret eventually leaves a paper trail, and the paper trail ends up here, in metal filing cabinets and microfiche readers and digitized databases that nobody bothered to make user-friendly, because nobody expected anyone to actually use them. You have to know what you're looking for, and you have to be willing to be patient, and you have to be able to look at a column of property transfer numbers without your eyes glazing over. 18 years in the Army had given me all 3 of those things. I spent 6 hours in that office. The clerk, a woman named Patrice, who looked like she had been filing documents since before I was born and had developed a deep personal relationship with the concept of alphabetical order, watched me from her desk with the expression of someone trying to decide whether I was interesting or a problem. By noon, she had apparently decided I was interesting enough to bring me a cup of coffee without being asked, which I took as a sign of something. What I found in those 6 hours was a pattern so consistent, it stopped feeling like coincidence approximately 45 minutes in. Over the previous 6 years, 31 properties in Harlan County had transferred to Harlan Revitalization Partners, or to holding companies traceable back to Kane Realty Group, which was the parent entity. 31 properties. In each case, the sequence was the same. An initial offer, a refusal, and then within weeks of the refusal, something that changed the calculus. A business license complication. A zoning dispute that appeared from nowhere and resolved itself immediately after the sale. A sudden and unexpected audit by the county tax assessor's office. 1 barn fire with an inconclusive investigation. 2 families who had been current on their property taxes suddenly appeared in default on records that didn't match their bank statements. And every single transfer had been approved, permitted, and recorded without delay or complication by the Harlan County government, in an office that answered to Mayor Joyce Kimball, whose name I remembered from the scholarship certificate she had handed me at my high school graduation. I sat in the parking lot of the records office at 3 in the afternoon with my notes spread across the passenger seat, and the November sun already starting to go flat and orange at the edges, the way winter sun does in Kentucky, when it's not planning to stay much longer. I had a pattern. A clear, documented, ugly pattern. What I didn't have yet was the thread that connected it to the name I'd seen on a board of directors the night before. I found that thread on a Tuesday, 4 days later, in the last place I expected. I had spent those 4 days talking to people, not as a lieutenant colonel, not in uniform, not with any introduction that preceded me with authority, just as Maya Reeves, Loretta's daughter, the one who went into the Army. I talked to a woman named Delma Vargas, whose family farm had been transferred to Kane Realty 4 years earlier after a barn fire and an insurance complication that nobody at the county level had seen fit to investigate. I talked to a retired school teacher named Curtis Odom, who had accepted an offer on his property after a zoning dispute appeared on a parcel he'd owned free and clear for 30 years. I talked to two elderly sisters named Henderson, who had sold their late mother's house 6 months after their brother, who had been handling the estate, received a letter from the county assessor's office, incorrectly stating that he owed back taxes dating to 2015. Each story had the same shape. Each story had a different face on it. The thread came from an unexpected direction. I was sitting in the parking lot of the Harlan Savings Bank on a Tuesday morning. I had been watching the building, which I realize sounds more dramatic than it was. I was mostly just thinking when a young man in a bank teller's vest walked out the side door and stopped when he saw me. He was maybe 28. He had the look of someone who had been not sleeping enough for long enough that it had stopped being a crisis and become just a condition. "You're Loretta Reeves's daughter," he said. Not a question. I said I was. He looked back at the building behind him, then at me, then at his shoes. "I can't talk to you here," he said. His name was Marcus Lee. He had worked at Harlan Savings for 3 years in the loan processing department, and 2 evenings later, he left something under the windshield wiper of my rental car in the parking lot of the Kroger, on the edge of town. Not a note, not a letter. A USB drive in a plain white envelope with nothing written on it. I drove back to my mother's house, plugged it into my laptop at the kitchen table, and opened the first file. It was a spreadsheet, customer account numbers, dates, loan status codes. Next to each account number, a second column of dates, and I recognized the pattern immediately because I had been looking at its mirror image in the county property records for 4 days. The dates in the second column preceded, by an average of 18 days, the dates on which those customers had received unsolicited offers to purchase their properties from Harlan Revitalization Partners. Someone at Harlan Savings Bank was selling information about customers who were behind on their loans, names, addresses, the financial vulnerability that made them targets to a company that was then appearing at their doors with lowball offers before they'd had time to find any other solution. I sat with that for a while, made more tea, sat some more. Then I opened the second file. It was an email chain, internal, between accounts I didn't recognize at first glance, dated 2019. I read through it slowly, the way you read something when you suspect it's going to be important, and you don't want to miss anything by going too fast. The email chain concerned a logistics and construction contract awarded to a company called Kent Tech Construction Group for infrastructure work at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The contract value was $40 million. The procurement officer whose signature appeared on the final approval documents was a major in the Army's contracting division. The email chain was between two people discussing the contract, in terms that made clear they considered it already decided, discussing it before the official bid process had even opened. The names on the email accounts were abbreviated to initials, the way people abbreviate when they think they're being careful. But one of the emails included a full signature block that hadn't been removed before forwarding. The signature belonged to Marcus Webb. I sat very still at that kitchen table for a long time. Kent Tech Construction Group. I pulled up my notes from the records office and ran the name through the corporate filings I'd photographed. Kent Tech's parent company was Kane Holding Group. Kane Holding Group's subsidiary for real estate development in eastern Kentucky was Harlan Revitalization Partners. The $40 million Army contract had been steered, through a procurement process that had the signature of someone I trusted, to a company connected through 2 corporate layers to the same entity that was sending men to my mother's shop to tell her to sign or else. My father had known. That was the thing I couldn't stop staring at, somewhere in the middle of all of it. When I had assembled enough of the picture to see its shape, my father, a coal miner with a high school education and 43 years of watching this county and everyone in it, had figured out what was happening here. He had started writing it down. He had told me, in the last week he could still manage full sentences, that something didn't add up, that he had written things down, that I should find the green notebook. I had thought he was confused. I went to the shop the next morning and found the green notebook in the back of the bottom drawer of his workbench, under a box of spare watch parts in sizes I hadn't known they still made. His handwriting, cramped and careful, the handwriting of a man who had never had much paper to waste. Names, dates, addresses, amounts. 31 entries going back to 2017. He had been tracking the same pattern I had found in the county records office. But from the inside, from the conversations he'd had with neighbors, from the things people told him in the shop, from the particular knowledge that comes from living in a small place for long enough that you understand how things are supposed to work and can feel immediately when they stop working that way. On the last page of the notebook, in larger letters than anything else in it, he had written a name, Marcus Webb. Under it, one line, "Ask Maya. She'll know what to do with this." I had to put the notebook down and walk outside and stand in the cold for about 10 minutes before I could go back in and keep reading. He had known. He had known. And he had trusted me with it. And he had not lived long enough to give it to me directly. The thing I had to reckon with the thing that required the 10 minutes in the cold, and then several more hours that night, lying awake, staring at that water stain, was the question of why my father had gotten sicker, faster, than his doctors expected in that last year. The VA had misplaced his paperwork. The medication approvals had been delayed in ways that his primary care doctor had called, in a letter I found in his files, administratively unusual. His chart had been flagged for a secondary review that never happened. One letter had been sent to the wrong county entirely. I could not prove what I suspected. I want to be clear about that. I could not prove it, and I am not going to claim it as fact. Because it isn't fact yet, it's a pattern, and a suspicion. And the specific sick feeling of a daughter who has spent 18 years being trained to recognize the difference between an accident and a decision. But I know what I believe. And I know what my father wrote on the last page of that notebook. The next morning, Daniel Marsh came back. I was in the shop when I heard the bell over the door. My mother had come in early to do inventory, the kind of stubborn normalcy that I recognized as her way of refusing to be frightened out of her own space. And I had come with her partly to help and partly because I wasn't ready to leave her alone in there with the door unlocked. Marsh came in with a man I didn't recognize and a woman carrying a leather portfolio, and he smiled the smile of someone who had walked into rooms like this one many times before and had almost always gotten what he came for. "Mrs. Reeves," he said, "and this must be your daughter. The soldier." He said times the soldier, times with a specific inflection of someone using a word as a diminishment rather than a description. I have heard that inflection before. It doesn't land the way people who use it intend for it to land, when you have spent 18 years earning what the word actually means. I said, "Lieutenant Colonel Reeves. You can call me Maya if you'd like." Something shifted in his face, not much, barely perceptible, the recalibration of a man who has just gotten slightly different information than he expected. He kept the smile in place, because men like Marsh are professional about their smiles. "Of course," he said. "I was hoping we could have a conversation today about the offer on the table. I understand there may be some questions about—" "The assessed value is $312,000, I said. "Your offer is $47,000. I don't have a question about that. I have a conclusion." He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at my mother, who was standing behind the counter with her hands flat on the glass case above the display of watch movements, very still, the way she went still when she was paying attention to everything at once. "The assessed value doesn't always reflect current market conditions in a distressed area," Marsh said. He said times distressed area, times the way you say something that's supposed to sound clinical, but is actually designed to make you feel bad about where you're from. "We found that families in challenging situations often prefer the certainty of a cash transaction over the uncertainty of—" "Mr. Marsh," I said, "I'm going to make this simple. We're not selling. And the next time you or anyone representing your organization comes to this shop, I would encourage you to have your attorney present. Because I'm going to have mine? I didn't have an attorney. That wasn't the point." He looked at me one more time, the look of a man reassessing risk, doing the mental arithmetic of what I might or might not know, deciding whether I was bluffing, and then he thanked my mother for her time in a tone that contained no gratitude whatsoever, and left. My mother waited until the door closed. Then she said, "You don't have an attorney." "Not yet," I said. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Then she went back to her inventory. The call came that afternoon, not from Marsh, from Fort Campbell. I was sitting in my rental car outside the county records office. I had gone back for more documents. The kind of visit where you know you've already found the important thing, but you keep pulling files because stopping feels dangerous. When my phone buzzed with a number I recognized as the administrative office of my brigade. The message, relayed from my brigade executive officer with the careful neutrality of someone reading a document they didn't write, was that my leave had been noted and was approved through its current end date, but that upon my return I was to report to General Hargrove's office for a meeting regarding times a review of conduct potentially inconsistent with standards of military professionalism. The language was specific in the way that language is specific when someone has had a lawyer help them write it. I sat in that car for a long time after the call ended. The November afternoon was doing the thing Kentucky November afternoons do when they're trying to remind you that winter is not a metaphor, the light going thin and cold at the edges, the sky the color of old pewter, the temperature dropping in a way you could feel through the car windows even with the heat running. I thought about what I stood to lose. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as though the right thing to do was obvious and immediate and unambiguous, and it wasn't. I was 18 years into a career I had built from nothing, from a girl in a pickup truck with an army contract, and no particular plan beyond the next thing in front of her. The promotion board was 60 days out. Full colonel. Everything I had worked toward since I was 23 years old. Every early morning and every deployment and every decision I had made that was harder than the alternative, it all ran through that board. And someone had made a call. Not to threaten me directly, they were smarter than that. Just to make clear that the system I operated in had been notified that I was asking questions, and that the system had some questions of its own. I sat there and I thought about my father's voice in the last week he could hold a full conversation. I thought about 31 families in 6 years. I thought about a green notebook in the bottom drawer of a workbench. I thought about 17 seconds of audio, and a woman trying not to make a sound. Then I drove back to my mother's house and sat down at her kitchen table with a legal pad and her old laptop. I didn't want to use my Army-issued equipment for what I was about to do, and I began to write. I want to tell you about the Office of Special Counsel, because most people don't know it exists, and that's partly by design. It's an independent federal agency, independent of the military, independent of the executive agencies. It oversees that exists specifically to investigate retaliation against federal employees and military members who report wrongdoing. It's not the FBI. It's not the Inspector General. It's smaller, quieter, and in my experience precisely as effective as it needs to be when the right information reaches it. I knew about it because of a woman named Diana Torres. Diana and I had gone through the same advanced leadership program at Fort Leavenworth in 2015. She had left active duty in 2018 and gone to work as an investigator for the OSC, which she described to me at the time as times the most interesting job available to someone who spent 12 years watching the Army almost do the right thing. We had stayed in intermittent contact, the kind of contact that exists between people who respect each other enough to stay in touch but are both too busy to do it properly. I called her on a Wednesday evening from the front porch of my mother's house, wrapped in my father's old barn coat because it was the warmest thing available and I needed air, and I told her what I had. Not everything, not the full picture, not the green notebook, not the suspension of my leave review, just enough for her to understand what shape the thing was. She listened without interrupting for 22 minutes. I know the duration because I was watching my phone screen while I talked, the kind of anxious monitoring you do when you're not sure the call is going to stay connected. When I finished, she said, "Send me what you have. Physical copies if you can manage it. Don't send anything through Army email or from any device connected to Army infrastructure." Then she said, "Maya, this is going to take time, and it's going to cost you something. You understand that?" "I know," I said. "I need you to say it out loud. What it's going to cost." I looked out at the dark yard, at the bare trees at the edge of the property, at the place where my father used to keep a kitchen garden that my mother had let go after he died, because gardening had always been his thing and not hers. And she hadn't been ready to make it hers yet. "The promotion board," I said. "My record. Maybe the career." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe not. But you have to go in knowing maybe." "I know," I said again. There was a pause on the line. Then, "Okay, send me what you have." Sending what I had meant, a trip to a FedEx office in Middlesboro, the next county over, where I spent 2 hours photocopying documents and printing files and organizing everything into a package that Diana could receive, and that could not be traced back to any Army system or facility. I drove there on a Thursday morning in a car that I checked twice in the parking lot for anything that shouldn't have been there, which felt paranoid until I remembered the phone call from Fort Campbell and decided that a certain level of paranoia was probably just accurate. I mailed the package. I drove back to Harlan. I made my mother lunch and sat with her in the shop for a while, watching her work on a lady's Elgin from the 1940s that had come in needing a new mainspring, her hands moving through the familiar motions of something she had been doing for 4 decades, with the efficiency of deep practice. She didn't ask me what I had been doing. She was good at not asking. That evening, Marcus Webb called me. I had been half expecting it, not because I thought he knew about Diana Torres, but because the call from Fort Campbell had told me someone had been made aware that I was looking into things, and Webb was the most logical person to follow up on that awareness. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message in the measured, reasonable tone I recognized from 3 years of working for him, saying that he had heard I was back in Harlan, and that he hoped everything was all right with my family, and that if I had time he would like to catch up. There was nothing in the message that wasn't plausibly deniable. He was good at plausibly deniable. I called him back the next morning and agreed to meet him at a diner 2 towns over. Neutral ground, public space. He suggested it. I accepted. What I didn't tell him was that I was bringing my father's green notebook in my bag, because I wanted to see his face when I decided whether or not to mention it. We sat across from each other in a booth by the window, coffee between us. And he did what people with things to protect always do when they're trying to determine what you know. He asked questions and listened to the answers very carefully, the way you listen, when you're not listening, for information, but for the shape of what the person across from you is choosing. Not to say, he asked about my mother. I said she was well. He asked about the shop. I said it was still open. He asked, with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, whether I had found Harlan County Times, much changed time since I was last home. Some things, I said. He nodded slowly, looking at his coffee. It's a difficult situation here. Has been for years. The economic case for what Kane is doing is actually pretty solid, Maya. I know it doesn't feel that way when it's your family, but someone has to invest in these areas and the alternatives. Marcus, I said, I know about Kent Tech. He stopped. I watched his face in the way 18 years of reading rooms had trained me to watch faces, not looking at the eyes, which people control, but at the small involuntary muscles around them, at the throat, at the hands around the coffee cup. His hands, I noted, had gone very still. I don't know what you think you found, he said, and his voice was careful in a way that confirmed everything I needed to confirm. I think I found a $40 million contract that was steered through a procurement process with your signature on it, to a company connected to the same organization that's been running a property acquisition scheme in this county for 6 years, I said. And I think my father knew about it. And I think that when he started writing things down, someone made sure his VA paperwork kept getting lost. The diner was quiet around us. A waitress refilled someone's coffee at a table across the room. A truck went by outside on the highway. Webb looked at me for a long time. And then he said the thing that I think he had been building towards since he sat down, the thing that was designed to be the closing argument, the reason to walk away. Maya, he said, think about what you're about to do to your career. I thought about my father's handwriting on the last page of the green notebook. Ask Maya. She'll know what to do with this. I already know what I'm going to do, I said. I just wanted you to know that I know. Before you heard it from someone else, I left my coffee on the table and walked out into a cold morning that tasted like wood smoke in coming winter. And I sat in my rental car for exactly 4 minutes before I started the engine, because 4 minutes was what it took for my hands to stop shaking. The investigation took 11 weeks. I'm going to tell you that plainly, because I think there's a version of this story that compresses those 11 weeks into something faster and more cinematic, and that version would be a lie. 11 weeks is a long time when you're waiting. It's a long time when you're still technically on leave that you know is being scrutinized. It's a long time when every few days Marsh or someone from his office drives past the shop slowly enough that you notice, but not slowly enough that you can call it anything other than driving past. During those 11 weeks, several things happened. My promotion board convened and considered my file. I was not contacted about the outcome. This was not a good sign. Marcus Lee, the young man from the bank, lost his job in a restructuring that eliminated his entire department, which might have been coincidence and might not have been. He left Harlan County for Louisville and sent me a text message the day he left that said Times, I hope it was worth it Times, without specifying for whom. My mother and I fell into a routine that I had not expected to find comforting. She opened the shop at 8. I came in at 9 with 2 coffees, the good kind from the gas station 2 blocks over that had recently gotten a real espresso machine. I sat at my father's workbench and organized his tools, which gave me something to do with my hands while I waited for emails and thought through contingencies. She repaired watches and talked to the occasional customer, and did not ask me for updates, which was her way of trusting me. My brother James came home in the 7th week. He appeared on a Thursday morning without calling ahead, which was how James operated. Had always operated arriving rather than announcing himself, as though the announcement was somehow more of an imposition than the arrival. He had a duffel bag and 3 days of stubble and the look of someone who had driven a long way and was prepared to stay longer than he'd packed for. He had been in Nashville. We hadn't spoken in any meaningful way in almost 3 years, which was the combined product of his distance and my deployments, and the particular kind of estrangement that happens between siblings when a parent dies and they handle the grief so differently that for a while they can't find enough common ground to stand on together. He came into the shop and my mother looked at him, and something happened in her face that she would have been embarrassed for me to describe. So I'll only say that it was the specific relief of a woman who has been trying not to need things and has finally been given permission to need one. He sat down at the workbench across from me and looked around the shop for a long time. Then he picked up a small clock movement from the tray where my mother had been sorting parts and turned it over in his hands the way our father used to do, not examining it, just holding it. The particular gesture of someone who needed something to occupy their hands while they figured out what they were going to say. Mom called me, he said. I know she did. She didn't tell me what was actually going on. Just that you were home and that you were doing something. He set the movement down. What are you doing? I told him. Not the version I told people to inform them, but the version I told someone who already knew half the context, who had grown up in the same house looking at the same water stain on the ceiling, who had watched the same man paint the same gold lettering on the same window. He listened without interrupting, which was not a thing James did naturally. It cost him something. I could see that. The held stillness of a man choosing to receive rather than respond. When I finished, he said, Dad knew all of this? Most of it. The shape of it. James was quiet for a while. Then, he tried to tell me something, the last time I talked to him. On the phone. I thought he was. I thought it was the medication. He stopped, looked at his hands. I told him to get some rest. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would be more useful than silence. After a while, he said, What do you need? I told him. For the next 4 weeks, James stayed. He fixed the gutter over the back door of the house that had been pulling away from the fascia for 2 years. He repainted the shop sign, not the gold lettering, which neither of us would have touched, but the background behind it, which had gone gray. He drove my mother to her doctor's appointment in Pineville because I needed to be on a call. He made dinner 3 nights a week, which was not something anyone had expected from a man who had subsisted primarily on takeout for the better part of a decade. He did not talk about the past 3 years. Neither did I. There would be time for that later, and we both knew it, and the knowing was enough for now. The OSC's findings came on a Monday. Diana called me first, before any official notification, because she was Diana, and that was the kind of person she was. She told me that the preliminary findings supported referral for criminal investigation of the procurement irregularities connected to the Kent Tech contract, that the FBI's Public Corruption Unit had been notified, and that a pattern review of Harlan Revitalization Partners' acquisition practices was being opened at the state level in coordination with the Kentucky Attorney General's office. She also told me that my name was in the findings as the individual who had identified and reported the pattern. It would be public. I had known that going in. The promotion board, I said. A pause. The findings actually help you there. The inquiry that was opened against you has been closed. The conduct review was based on a complaint that is now itself under investigation. It doesn't automatically get you the promotion, Maya, but it removes the obstacle. I sat with that. How are you? She asked. I looked across the shop to where my mother was showing James how to clean a watch case without scratching the crystal, guiding his hands with the patience of a woman who had been teaching people to be careful for 43 years. The gold letters on the front window caught the morning light the way they always had, the way they had caught it for longer than I had been alive. I'm okay, I said. And then, because she had asked and she deserved an honest answer, I'm better than I was. Marcus Webb resigned his position on the board of Harlan Revitalization Partners on a Tuesday afternoon, according to a filing I found in the state corporate registry. The following week, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit conducted interviews at Fort Campbell that were described in the local news as Times routine inquiries into contracting practices. Kane Realty Group's operations in Harlan County were suspended pending the state investigation. The application for a zoning variance that would have allowed the commercial development of the Main Street properties the one that had been fast-tracked through Mayor Kimball's Neleverance with a timeline that made no administrative sense, was withdrawn. Daniel Marsh did not come back to the shop. None of this happened in the clean, final way that stories are supposed to happen. There were no handcuffs on a sunny morning. There was no moment where someone stood in a public place and said the words that made everything make sense. There was no resolution that fit neatly into a single afternoon. What there was, instead, was the slow, grinding, distinctly unglamorous work of consequences actually arriving, paperwork filed, interviews conducted, licenses suspended, questions asked in rooms I wasn't in by people I would never meet, the invisible machinery of accountability doing the thing it was supposed to do at exactly the speed that machinery operates, which is never as fast as you want it to be, and somehow still faster than you believe it will be when you're in the middle of waiting. The promotion board results came on a Friday. I was in the shop when my phone buzzed an official Army email, the kind with a header that looks like every other header until you read what's under it. I read it standing behind my father's workbench, in the shop he built, in the town where I grew up, wearing a flannel shirt that was not a uniform and had not been a uniform for 6 weeks, which was longer than I had spent out of uniform in consecutive days since 2001. I put the phone face down on the workbench, picked up the small clock movement my brother had been turning over in his hands a week ago, and turned it over in mine for a while, feeling the weight of it, the precise and intricate weight of something built to keep time. Then I picked the phone back up and read the email again. Colonel. My mother was watching me from across the room, pretending to rearrange a shelf. James was in the back, doing something with a box of supplies he'd gone to get 20 minutes ago and hadn't returned from yet, which probably meant he was in there listening. Well, my mother said. I set the phone down. Colonel, I said. She made a sound I had not heard her make in 2 years, not a word, just a sound. The sound of a woman whose chest has been holding something tight for long enough that letting go of it has a noise. She crossed the shop and put her arms around me the way she had when I was small, when the world felt too large and too loud, and she was the place it was safe to be smaller than it. I held on. I let myself hold on. After a while, she stepped back and looked at my face with the inventory expression, checking for damage, cataloging what she found. Whatever she found, she seemed satisfied with it. Your father, she said. And then she stopped, because there wasn't a sentence that needed to come after that. The 2 words were the sentence. They contained everything she meant. I know, I said. James came out of the back room with dust on his shirt, and the expression of someone who had definitely been listening, and was definitely not going to admit it. He looked at us. He looked at my face. He nodded once, the way men nod when they're feeling things they've decided to feel quietly. Then he said, I'm going to make dinner. Don't argue with me about it. Nobody argued with him about it. I want to tell you about the last morning before I drove back to Fort Campbell, because it's the morning I think about most now, more than any of the things that came after, more than the formal proceedings, more than the testimony, more than the afternoon I sat in a federal building, 2 counties over, and listened to a prosecutor read the counts of a criminal referral that contained, in a paragraph near the end, a notation about the reopening of an administrative inquiry into the circumstances surrounding the delayed medical care of a retired coal miner in 2019. It was a Sunday, cold, clear, the kind of November morning in Kentucky that reminds you why November can be beautiful if you're not trying to get away from it. My mother opened the shop at 8 even though Sundays were slower, because 43 years of opening at 8 had made 8 o'clock in the morning feel like the correct time for things to begin. I came in at 9 with 2 coffees, sat at my father's workbench. The gold lettering on the window caught the light the way it always did. A woman came in around 10:30 with a pocket watch, a Hamilton, railroad grade, probably from the 40s. In a case that had been polished so many times, the engraving on the back was nearly invisible. She said it had belonged to her grandfather and it had stopped, and she had been meaning to bring it in for a year and had finally decided to stop meaning to. My mother took it from her carefully, the way she took everything, with the particular attention of someone who understood that the thing you were handing her was not just the object, but also everything attached to it. The woman looked at me while my mother examined the watch. You're her daughter, she said. The one who times. She stopped. Started over. I heard about what you did. I shook my head. My mother didn't sell, I said. That's what started all of it. The woman looked at my mother, who was holding the Hamilton up to the light with her loupe. Already somewhere else. Already inside the mechanism. Already in the particular focused quiet of someone who knows exactly what they're looking at. The woman nodded slowly. Then she said, Will it be ready by Saturday? My mother looked up. Friday, she said. Come in the afternoon. The woman left. The bell over the door rang the way it had been ringing since 1979. My mother went back to the Hamilton. I turned back to the workbench and sat there for a while in the good quiet of a room where things were being repaired, where small broken things were being made to work again by someone who had been learning how to do that their whole life. I thought about 17 seconds of audio and what they had opened. I thought about 31 families and a green notebook and a man who had trusted me with something he couldn't finish. I thought about what it means to build something that lasts: a shop, a reputation, a record, a family's name in gold letters on a window, and what it means to protect it, not with force, not with rank, with patience, and with paper, and with the willingness to keep standing in a place where someone has told you to leave. The light moved across the floor the way it does in the morning, slow and certain, the way things move when they're not trying to be anything other than what they are. My mother looked up from the Hamilton and caught me looking at her. What? She said. Nothing, I said. Just nothing. She held my gaze for a moment with those steady eyes that I had been trying to learn for 18 years and would probably keep trying for 18 more. Then she went back to the watch, and I went back to the workbench, and outside the window the gold letters held the light for as long as the light was willing to stay. I drove back to Fort Campbell that afternoon, 3 hours and 40 minutes, the speed limit the whole way, which is what changes when you've stopped running from something and started moving toward whatever comes next. There's a thing people say when they find out what happened in Harlan County, a question they ask that I've answered enough times now that I've started to hear what they're really asking underneath it. They ask, was it worth it? And what they mean, I think, is, given what it cost, given the 11 weeks and the promotion board and the career that hung for a while on the edge of something I couldn't control, was the outcome worth the price? I understand why people ask it that way. We are trained, most of us, to think about things in terms of cost and outcome, input and return, risk and reward. I was trained that way too, more explicitly than most, by an institution that runs on exactly that kind of calculation. But I've come to think it's the wrong question. Not because the cost wasn't real, it was real. Every part of it, the sleepless nights and the shaking hands and the Tuesday at the kitchen table when I almost stopped. Not because I can pretend I didn't think about what I was risking, didn't feel the weight of what I stood to lose, but because the question assumes that what I did was a transaction, and it wasn't. My father didn't write down 31 names in a green notebook as a transaction. My mother didn't stand behind that counter and say no 3 times as a transaction. Kayla, or in our version, a young man who worked at a bank and left a USB drive under a windshield wiper, didn't take a risk for someone who had always been good to them because they were calculating returns. Some things you do because they're the next right thing, not because you know how they end. Not because you've run the numbers and the numbers favor you. Because someone you love is alone in a room with someone who believes the word times no times doesn't apply to them, and you have spent 18 years learning to be useful in exactly the situations where things could still go either way. I think about my father often, the way you think about someone when the shape of their absence is still new enough to surprise you. I think about the last week he could talk in full sentences, the green notebook he left in a drawer he knew I would eventually open, the 4 words he wrote on the last page. I think about the kind of faith that requires to leave something for someone who doesn't know yet that they'll need it. To trust a person with your unfinished business when you can't finish it yourself. I hope I carried it the way he meant for it to be carried. I think I did. And if there's someone watching this tonight who has a piece of unfinished business sitting in a drawer somewhere, a notebook, a recording, a folder they've been meaning to open, a conversation they've been meaning to have, I want to say this as plainly as I know how. The right time is not when conditions are perfect. Conditions are almost never perfect. The right time is when you finally decide that staying quiet is costing you something you can't afford to keep paying. That's what 17 seconds of audio taught me. That, and the fact that a 72-year-old woman with arthritis in both hands and a metal plate in her hip is, pound for pound, the most formidable person I have ever met in my life. She raised me. I should have known that from the start.